please feel free to grab some refreshments and snacks over there in the back and come join us again if you're looking for a seat. Plenty of room here in the front.
How are you?
Good evening, welcome. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our second lecture of the semester, but really the first lecture here in MD Anderson Hall of our annual lecture series entitled Engaging Pluralism. This particular topic of engaging pluralism relates to many aspects of a pluralistic world that we live in today. One can say we live in a pluralistic world in terms of ecologies, industries, political systems, but one particular aspect is also obviously human diversity, civilization, and culture, and how different cultures come in contact both in terms of a dialogue but also potential friction. That aspect of the topic I think is particularly important because if you look at our society, we have made many advances in terms of, for example, science or technology. Nothing against science or technology myself. I'm actually married to a scientist, so I support it strongly. But oftentimes I wonder that maybe we haven't made as many advances in terms of human relationships and how we talk to each other, how we care for each other, how we really engage each other in different cultures in a kind of a seamless and productive way. So in that sense, Kay Wayne Yang's talk today will give a particularly meaningful window into that aspect of our topic of engaging pluralism. He will be introduced this evening by Assistant Professor Maggie Tseng, who together with Carlos Jimenez has helped shape the theme and the content of the lecture series for this semester. And without much more ado, I'd like to invite Maggie to join me here and introduce Kay Wayne Yang. Thank you all.
Is this sound okay? No, it's not okay. Do I need it? Oh, it's better now.
It's working.
Oh, okay, fantastic. Great. Thank you, Igor, for the introduction. I'm very glad to be here today. Is it still okay? Checking. Down. Closer. Close is better. Okay. Dr. Kay Wayne Yang, or Wayne, is a professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of California, San Diego, where he's also provost of John Muir College. Wayne's work transgresses the line between scholarship and community, as evidenced by his involvement in urban education and community organizing. Before his academic career, he was a public school teacher in Ohlone Territory, now called Oakland, California, where he co-founded the Avenues Project, a youth development nonprofit organization, as well as East Oakland Community High School, which were inspired by the survival programs of the Black Panther Party. An accomplished educator, Wayne has taught high school in Oakland, California for over 15 years and is a recipient of the Academic Senate Distinguished Teaching Award. Wayne writes about decolonization and everyday epic organizing. With his collaborator, Eve Tuck, he is currently convening the Land Relationships Super Collective, edited the book series. I wonder if I should click this. Oops. Okay, edited the, sorry.
You can fix it later. Don't worry about it.
Okay, I'll just finish. And edited the book series titled Indigenous and Decolonizing Studies in Education. He recently published a book on the relationship between 200 US land grant institutions and American settler colonialism called A Third University is Possible. And he's also written extensively about cities as sites of settler colonialism. I first came across Wayne's work when I read the article Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, which was co-written with Eve Tuck. And this was such a profound and instructive text for me as a young and new teacher and educator. So as part of our lecture series, Engaging Pluralism, which aims to reflect on the frictions and contradictions embedded within the project of pluralism, please join me in welcoming Wayne.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much. So bear with me, everybody. I had the screen working perfectly just before the intro started happening. Do we have a...
So with Houston, we have a problem.
Houston, we have a problem? So just bear with me a little bit here. Let's see. It's looking for it now. Yeah, isn't that strange? That is truly unfortunate. Mirror. You're getting it on your end, but not.
I'm getting it on mine, but I'm getting at the projector.
Oh. Is Mercury in retrograde?
Yeah, it's like it's not connecting to the projector.
Do I have to plug this in? Leave it. Well, while we're waiting for hopefully the tech will come through, a little bit of a prep for you is I'm going to ask you to talk with each other. So make sure you know the person next to you. And we'll go along with this. At various points, I'm going to ask you to think about a question, because it's a question I think about. And you're going to talk to the person next to you about your thoughts around it, okay? So introduce yourselves to each other if you don't know the person next to you.
Now it's stuck.
Yeah, that's strange. So we're going to have this eerie blue light.
I know. For your first, that is so weird. We never had that. So weird.
That's perfect.
Hello, everybody.
All right, everybody, welcome back. It's the ghost in the machine. It's taken over. So, oh goodness. All right. Do you think it's my laptop? Could be. Should we switch machines or? Yes. Okay, let's close this.
Go to P.
I can't see. Sorry.
There you go.
All right. That's fine. That'll work. Yep.
It's a one. There's one.
Yep, that's one. All right. So, hi everybody. Let's give a big round of applause for me for get the spirits back up. So, I'll first want to acknowledge where we are. So this is actually, I saw this was an art project that's installed outside the Houston airport, and it is a land-based project, and you can tell it's the U.S.-Mexico border. So you sort of see the curve of the Rio Grande, and then I came from San Diego, which is around here, and I think we're over here, right, for Houston. My understanding is, this is work by the artist Molly Gachman. I think it was installed like in 2018. So San Diego is actually, UC San Diego where I am is Kumeyaay country, and their territory extends on both sides of the US-Mexico border. One thing about San Diego is that the county has the largest number of Native American reservations of any county in the country. There's 13 federally recognized nations, and then there's about 5 village communities in Mexico. So my understanding is that Houston is very complicated in terms of the Native presence and history here. This is something I pulled from the University of Houston, sorry. It represents, I think this is from the land map, but actually kind of like Rice University's land acknowledgement, which acknowledges the present day communities such as the Apache, the Comanche, the Caddo, the Kiowa, the Wichita nations. So I hope that what I have to say is in right relationship to these places. I'd like to thank all of you for showing up, all the people in balcony seats over there. And I'd like to thank Dean Igor Marjanovic, who actually is the reason I said yes. I don't give a lot of talks these days, but because of our relationship, I just knew this was going to be great. Professors Maggie Sang and Carlos Jimenez, Carla Haskins, and special thanks for Lauren Coleman's ushering me in, despite the thunderstorms, got here safely. This is the title of my talk, but I had a different title. It was called Winter Soldier, What Are You Plotting? I thought it was really clever and also a little cringy, and that's why I didn't do it. But this is just referencing sort of the great Caribbean philosopher and thinker, Sylvia Wynter. And I'm using a lot of her work, and particularly not only her work, but Katherine McKittrick's thinking about Sylvia Wynter's work. And they both write about plot and plantation. So I want to position myself with respect to some of these questions I'm going to ask you. So in your pairs, somewhere along the way, I'm going to ask you, what are you plotting? What are you drawing? What are you conspiring? What are you planning? Right? That's what I mean by plotting. The whole possibility of that word, right? And then there's some sub-questions that are more abstract. You could answer about yourself or not about yourself, which is, what is the architecture of refuge, of fugitivity? What is the architecture of indigenous sovereignty? And at the intersection of those two ideas, what is the architecture of Black and indigenous futurity? It's not because this is the only relationship that matters, but the Black-indigenous relationship is one that is fundamentally important when we think about colonization and decolonization. So that's why I'm going to ask you to think about those things. And in terms of my own positioning in this, obviously I'm not Black, I'm not indigenous, and I have reasons why I ask myself these questions. So that's why I'm going to ask them of you as well. I'll also offer three answers or three examples for these as well, but just know that I'm thinking and I'm learning, and I would love to learn from you. So I don't claim to understand everything that I'm going to talk about. That's the beauty when the text exceeds the person, right? I'm sharing with you things that I think I've overheard, things that I think I've read, and I know that there's a limitation to that, and I hope that you can take whatever you can from this. But one of the things I think about is sometimes these knowledges that we hear, they might not have been intended for us. They might have been intended for us to share with somebody else who was really supposed to hear it. And so these writers like Sylvia Wynter and Katherine McKittrick, they certainly have people in mind when they're writing. And then they are also writing for people they might never have imagined would be listening. So they might be writing to me, they might be writing to you, and that's where we're going to go today. So I want to start with this idea of plantation. So I like to think about the place that I'm going to. So this is actually a plantation in Texas. Anybody know the one? Yes?
Well, it says they're vulnerable.
You can see that small? I can't even read that. Yeah, it's Varner Hogg Plantation. It's very famous. It's named after the first person who started the plantation, and then the last person who owned the plantation, who was also governor of Texas, right? And this is actually taken from a video from a Rice University class, and there's a bunch of videos and archaeology they're doing there right now. But I chose this screenshot because it's got a picture of the big house. And the big house, you can see, is surrounded by all these trees. I think a lot of them are pecan trees. And it's beautiful, right? I mean, that's the whole idea of that architecture. So there's an architectural design here of the way the house fits into its quote-unquote natural surroundings, right? And that these sort of logics behind how we think about certain kinds of buildings are still in effect, right? And they are plantation logics. In this case, they're aesthetic or building logics. The Varner Hogg's plantation, and just to connect that for a second, I know this is a loose connection. I'm talking to architects, so you're going to say I'm wrong. That's fine. This is an image from Palm Springs, right? This very famous modernist architecture there. And and I'm learning this from my friend who was a practicing architect and is now a professor of architectural history, Manuel Schwartzberg-Carrillo. And he actually researched the development of water rights in Palm Springs, which is the Agua Caliente tribe of Luiseño Indians. So the interesting thing with this architecture, according to Manuel, is that it's built with the natural surrounding in mind, right? So that you sit here and you enjoy the scenery by your swimming pool or out your window, and it benefits from the displacement of indigenous people. So there's a whole checkerboard pattern in Palm Springs where some lands cannot be developed and indigenous people can't use them, and that's what provides this sort of natural scenery, right? So there's a way in which the architectural options, right, the opportunities for modernism are built into the opportunities provided by settler colonialism, all right? And sorry, it's the Agua Caliente band of Cahuilla Indians, not Luiseño Indians. So back to the same video footage. This is this kind of drone footage. Anybody know what that is? It's a little blurry. Yeah, it's an oil pump on a plantation, right? So Varner was a slave owner who came and got, I can't remember, 256 acres, I can't remember how many acres of land, about an hour south of Houston. And I think they did mostly sugar. I think at its height, there were 100 enslaved people who built the plantation. They built the big house that you saw. They built the quarters that they had to live and die in. And then Varner, the next owner came along, and then Hogg came, and this was actually after emancipation, and still maintained the plantation. And Hogg believed that there was oil underneath all that land. And so wouldn't sell it even when it was no longer profitable, left it for his descendants, and sure enough, like 15 years after he died, they struck oil, and that family is incredibly wealthy, and they're very fundamental to modern Texas history, right? So what I find really interesting about this is you have all these things. You have indigenous land where people have been displaced. You have enslaved people brought here to work the land, and you have extraction, right? These are kind of the fundamental economic systems that have built North America, right? If not, you know, not many greater parts of the world as well. And there are logics to this plantation structure that we still live in today, right? And that's kind of where I'm going with this, right? So this is another image from Rice University. There's an archaeology course taught by two professors who, and one of them, I'll come to her name in a minute, is explaining a lot about these histories. So this is actually an image from, not from Texas, it's from Virginia, but it captures something about plantation logic, right? Which is that there is a whole infrastructure built around it. There are railroads, there are banks, there are stores, there are warehouses, there's distribution. It's not simply this place where people are enslaved to work the land. It is actually a whole economic system. And the roads we have, the shipping routes, they were built by the structure, right? So we are living in this plantation future, if you will, right? This actually is taken, this photo is taken after emancipation as well. But you sort of see how the same structures of the plantation industry, agricultural industry has continued into the future. And hopefully you'll see that as we keep going. So one of the things I think about in terms of the spatial logics or the political economy of the plantation is this larger national infrastructure, right? So these red lines represent railroads through Texas and throughout the sort of middle South, right? And there's this great book I recommend reading by Manu, sorry, I'm blanking on all kinds of names right now. It's called Empire's Tracks. And one of the things he discusses is how, if you look at railroad patterns in places like the African continent, in India, they actually represent the path of empire. And the same thing is true in the United States. Like these represent pathways for invasion, for settlement, for annexation. And he documents all this from the perspectives of indigenous people and Chinese railroad workers, right? So a very different perspective. One of the things, though, he mentions is how even US soldiers who were fighting in the quote-unquote Indian wars in the Southwest, some of them would report, like, why are we fighting in these foreign wars? Like, why are we in foreign territory fighting for land? Because that was how it was perceived. And so he's one of these historians and writers who is restoring the fact of US empire into our consciousness. Like, we don't think we live in an empire, right? But actually, the United States is completely an empire. And George Washington, as historians will say, was one of the most successful builders of empire, and even reflected on it later in his life, right? So, so these railroads represent, in some ways, the same logic of settler colonialism, which is a plantation logic. And just to get into that for a second, anybody know what this image is down here? It's one of our early settlements. It's the first sustainable settlement in North America. Yes, it's Jamestown, right? It's a triangular fort, which I think is really neat because we always talk about a settler colonial triangle. So it's not literally a triangle, but this is a nice reminder. And what we see in Jamestown is a settlement, starts off as Fort James, and it crashes. It fails multiple times. It's a corporate venture, right? And they just can't sustain it. And then finally in 1619, they bring in some abducted Africans, and that's what sustains this settlement eventually. So slavery that sustains the settlement is also another thing, which is up to then they had indentured servants, and for the first time they said, well, you can not only become free after some time, but you can come to own property. So they start selling land, because before that they were just like a corporate, almost like a factory in some far-off place. But now they said, we're going to settle, we're going to sell private land. And so what we see is the reinvention of race. So in ethnic studies, we talk about how race is a social construction. We don't mean it doesn't exist. It does, right? It's just that what it means is created for us, right? And so here, race is reinvented in the sort of triangular relationship to land, right? You have black people who are considered property and cannot own land, right? You have indigenous land that is claimable property, which means indigenous people must leave, right? They must be removed. And then finally, you have the creation of whiteness as property ownership, right? So this didn't necessarily exist this way in Europe even. So we often equate Europe with whiteness, and there's reasons for that. But really, if you think about North America, what does whiteness mean? It is actually connected to property ownership, owning land and people, right? And what does blackness mean? It's neither of those things. In indigeneity, it's also neither of those things, but in a different way. So we have this interesting relationship that then has sort of determined race relations in the United States for quite some time. So that's why we say it's an invention. Malcolm X says, it's like a Cadillac. Racism is reinvented all the time, right? And this is one of these early things. Now, I want to note that we say 1619, but actually in Texas, the first enslaved African was, I think, 1528. Because Spanish Empire. So when we think about the plantation, it's not simply this East Coast phenomenon. It is something that is sort of remade over and over and over to fit the sort of economic and political realities that the powerful want, right? And so here's a quote by Katherine McKittrick, who says, the plantation is a persistent but ugly blueprint of our contemporary spatial troubles. And she and Sylvia Wynter are making this argument that today's capitalist ecology is not that different from the plantation. It's only much more sophisticated and expansive in geography. So we still have spatial architectures of transport, imprisonment, resource extraction. And that is what, again, thinking back to Jamestown, that's what sustained Jamestown, right? And here, it's just that the extraction can happen so far away from us or so hidden from us that we don't notice it when we turn on the lights, right? When we turn on the water. The plantation's economies, racial order, and ability to self-sustain through these extractions might feel familiar because we are living in it. We are living in the science fiction future of the plantation. We're living in science fiction right now. And so McKittrick says, the plantation moves through time, a cloaked anachronism that calls forth the prison, the city, and so forth. So she's saying basically every kind of spatial political place in North America has some connection or root into plantation logic, right? This is one of the professors here of art history, Fabiola Lopez Duran, who is bringing students to the plantation. Now I'm really, really nervous. No, I'm just kidding. So thank you for your work. This is amazing. Thank you for your work. Yeah, and then to quote you. Well, it's quoting you, quoting somebody else, which is also, I love it when that happens, right? So the plantation system is migratory. The relationship between black dispossession and geography has been recast over and over again. And here is an image that you have actually in that webpage, which is anybody know what this is?
Chain gang.
It's chain gang, right? Which is what? Legally. It's not a trick question. So it's legal slavery after the passage of the 13th Amendment, is if you're incarcerated, you may be enslaved. And these are convict leasing gangs. So once you're in prison, you can then be rented out to a plantation. And this is how the hog plantation sustained itself, was through convict leasing, which was much more brutal than many forms of chattel slavery prior to that, because you didn't care if people died on you, right? Because you were just renting them from the prison system. And then when that became seen as too ugly and too violent, they turn to sharecropping, right? So there's just some ways in which the plantation logic keeps continuing, even though the laws might change that, allegedly slavery is abolished, right? So moving along, here's another image of yours. This one is the outline of one of the quarters in which the enslaved individuals used to live and built themselves, right? And this gets to the second thing. So I talked about how oil was found under the Varner Hogg plantation and how that established this massive wealth. And Texas is known for its oil wealth, right? And this is part of the narrative that we all know, right? We all know about this country, about Texas. And so when Sylvia Wynter talks about the plot in a plantation, she's talking about the plot of a story, like the narrative of a story. This is the story we talk about settler colonialism, but we don't call it that. We call it the founding of a nation, right? And so the plantation is the storyline, is the plot for the expansion of this country, the romance that we have with this country, if you believe in that sort of grand narrative of the Grand South and oil barons and so forth, right? But Wynter also talks about this as a plot, right? The plot of land. The plot of land that was set aside, in this case, on the other side of the creek from the big house, right? The plot of land that's set aside for the enslaved people to figure out how to live, right? So grow something there, build yourself someplace to live, try not to die, have children who will also be enslaved. Like that is what this plot does, right? So as horrible as that is, right, this plot also refers to this where black people made the impossible possible, right? This is where black people cultivated not only survival, but also epistemologies and knowledges and connections to the land. In fact, the archaeology that's done in plantations now is to recover some of the African epistemologies, philosophies, and worldviews that were present in like people's pottery and things like that, right? So these are connections to land, but also joy, love, resistance, the secretive stories that became the source of guerrilla resistance to the plantation system. Here I'm quoting McKittrick. So what McKittrick says, which I find very, very difficult, so hopefully you'll find this difficult too. If not, then I'm just not that smart. And you can explain to me later, but she says, in the plantation, we have a black future, or black futures, right? Now I hate that because I don't want to believe the plantation has a future. She calls these plantation futures. I want to believe the plantation is done, right? And what she says is, no, we're living in it. But even though we're living in it, black people still make a future and have always done so. And that is sort of a black radical tradition that continues. And so why not imagine black futures are possible despite, within, without, and beyond this reality? So that's kind of where we're going today, speculatively together, all the questions I'm going to ask you. So I think I read this already, but the plot spatializes what would be considered impossible otherwise. Here's some other images from Professor Lopez Duran. And this is bricks, again, made by hand to build the big house and also the quarters and the factories, those kinds of things, made by enslaved people. And the secretive stories are in the bricks because it's very hard to find records of what black people were thinking, saying, doing, because they're not kept, right? But there are fingerprints on these bricks. And so those are kind of the messages that people are trying to decipher today, and also speaking to folks' descendants and their family histories. So another thing, though, around the plot is there's also black conspiracy. There's also black stories, right? There's also black infrastructures. And here we have the routes of the Underground Railroad here in Texas. So the Underground Railroad here were people migrating to Mexico where slavery was illegal, right? And so these also have infrastructures that exist today, only they're lesser known because they're not celebrated, they're not talked about, right? So when we talk about what are you plotting, what is the plot that is fugitivity, of seeking refuge. What does that look like today? So fugitivity and freedom also have an infrastructure. Another example of this is Texas freedom colonies. This is the work of Dr. Andrea Roberts, who is now, I want to say, at University of Virginia, but was here at Texas A&M and created this project at Texas A&M. You can actually go online and you can zoom in on all of these dots are what she calls freedom colonies or free towns. Right? These are black communities establishing places of their own and defending them, right? So you can actually zoom in and it'll tell you the name of the place. It's kind of, it's incredible work, right? So if you compare then, so here's the Warner Hog Plantation, and you look over here at this atlas of freedom colonies, you can see there's actually some right by the plantation. It's really interesting, right? Like slavery and plantation system, as totalizing as it is, it's not all powerful, right? There are cracks in the system, there are leaks, there's other infrastructures, there's always happening. And I think this is what McKittrick means by plantation futures, right? So I'm gonna skip that over. So Toni Morrison, before she became the great Nobel laureate writer, she was a publisher, and she actually compiled this book when she was a publisher. At the time, it wasn't even credited to her, and it's called The Black Book. And she was collecting all this everyday paraphernalia that black people had in the 18th and 19th centuries. And it included things like postcards, advertisements, ribbons, buttons, memos, memoirs, those kinds of things. And one of the things she noticed, you won't be able to read that. This is in the foreword of the book Paradise. She talks about doing this. And she said she saw whole universes and worlds that weren't in the books that black people had, right? And one of the things she noted is that in this part of the country, there were 50 newspapers run by black people, started right after emancipation. And she said that black people were starting these townships, and the way she words it is, well, I can't read this, with the same fervor as white people were also trying to move west and create and establish land. And she notes that at the same time, indigenous people were being displaced. So I just find really interesting this forward, how Morrison connects all these things together, indigenous people, black people, white settlers, in that relationship to land, right? And this is why the black indigenous relationship is an important one to think about and to build with and build on, because it's the one that is one part of that triangle that is going to rupture the way things have been set up, right? So that brings me to my question I'm going to ask you right now. So this doesn't have to be you personally, but when you think about architecture of refuge and fugitivity, what comes to mind, right? What could that look like? What have you seen maybe that makes you think, oh, that's what it looks like? And it could be small, like a plot, it could be architecture and the idea of planning. It could be a literal plot, like you've been to a space and it feels like a refuge, a space of fugitivity, or it could be infrastructural, like the Underground Railroad, right? I would like you to answer that question with each other for like 2 minutes. Talk to the person next to you. All right. I'm going to ask that you wrap up your thoughts. All right. So it's a question. It's an open-ended question. This is one of these questions I ask myself all the time, because the idea is if we start answering, there's going to be more than one answer. We will start trying to design and build those things. When I think about an example of this, this is a project I'm not involved with that I fanboy, right? But Renee Bird is actually a professor at Cal Poly Humboldt, I think, and started this thing called Earthseed Laboratories. And a black woman, she actually acquired land with water on it. You know, they're raising animals, and they're calling it Earthseed Laboratories, which is named after, anybody know? Earthseed is a reference to, thank you, Parable of the Sower, which is Octavia Butler's near future, where she imagines the grid is collapsing, we're running out of water, and this young girl leads this group up north into California and founds this colony called Earthseed, right? And so she's credited as being like one of these great thinkers of Afrofuturism. It's never a term she used. And the interesting thing is that book takes place in 2024, which is coming up, right? So this is a quote by Renee Bird, which there are cracks in empire everywhere. So people are finding different ways to enact these things. And what they're building in Earthseed Laboratories is a workshop, a barn, a medicinal herb and flower garden, an apothecary, outdoor altars, a freedom library, retreat center, a micro village of tiny homes, solar powered, right? So that's why it's called Earthseed. So check it out, or you can Google it online. My next question: what is the architecture of indigenous sovereignty? So indigenous sovereignty, it could mean political sovereignty, meaning indigenous people have their own governments, they are their own nations. It could be sovereignty of knowledge and epistemology, of lifeways and traditions. It could also be a sovereignty about the future, right? Like, what does an indigenous future look like? So what does that look like? What does indigenous sovereignty look like architecturally? What does the infrastructure look like? Please talk amongst yourselves. All right, if you could wrap it up. So I'm going to give you an example of some of the work that I'm involved with now. And then, just so you know, timing-wise, after this example, I have one more example that's more speculative, and then we're going to end. So we're doing pretty good on time. So this is a Sogorea-Te land trust. It is the first urban indigenous land trust run by Native women. This is the back of Karina Gold, who is Chichenyo Ohlone, and this is her territory, which is the territory that we think of as the San Francisco East Bay. So that's Oakland, Berkeley, places like that. Sogorea-Te Land Trust, I'm proud to say, is part of our land relationships super collective. Eve came up with that name because it's kind of like a collective of collectives, and she just thought it was funny, right? So super collective, if I click on this, it might even take us to our page. Oh, it does. No, it doesn't. Okay, so I'm almost afraid to do this, but I'm going to do it. There we go. All right. So hard to see. Let me expand it a little. So this is our webpage if you want to check us out. Currently we're working with 5 groups across North America. Some of them are indigenous, some of them are black run, some of them are neither of those things, but they all have to do with relationships, restoring human relationships to land. This is Sogorea-Te. This is the Underground Center in Saugerties, New York. This is the Black Land Project, Mistinguett Smith. Ogama-Mikana in Toronto, Ontario. They're primarily sort of art interventions. So you can see they're renaming like the names of signs with Anishinaabe names. Métis in Space. So Métis in Space is these 2 incredibly funny and smart and like really dangerously critical women, Molly Swain and Chelsea Vowell. They're both Métis in Canada. And they have a podcast. You should check it out. It's hilarious, Métis in Space. But they have actually just now started a land-based project where they've acquired all this land from this very nice white American person who gave them all this money. They call them their sugar settler. So I think they're on good terms with them. So those are some of our collaborators. And let me move back to where I was. See if I can do this. Okay. I'm glad you laughed at my bad jokes. That makes this so much easier for me. Oh, goodness. I'll just quit out of here. Go here. Oh, I'm scared. Yeah, I should never have left my PowerPoint slide. Oh my goodness. I feel lost. I know, huh? Okay, that's looking better. Oh my God. All right. I will do. Whoops, not that. No. Here we go. I can't believe this is happening. All right. Let's hope this works. Okay, I think I was right here. All right. Oh, wow.
Yep, there you go.
Woohoo! Okay, I'm going to breeze through the next few things. So let me talk about Sogorea-Te and with respect to architecture. So one thing about the Bay Area is there are these huge shell mounds, right? And these are places where indigenous people would bury their ancestors. They would meet and gather. There'd be they almost like urban centers. This is there's over 450 of them in just the East Bay alone. And they've been built on top of over time, like dug into, bulldozed. The largest was like the size of 3 football fields. It was that big. It was really like a city. And this one is in Emeryville. where they have now built a mall. But as part of building the mall, they named the road Shellbound Street, which is, I guess, supposed to be inclusive, but is it's seen as very disrespectful, and they built this artificial mound to sort of simulate the mound, right? But they've been fighting the protection of these mounds for quite some time. This was actually how Sogorea Te came into existence, was protecting one of their sacred sites named Sogorea Te. Where does architecture fit in this? Well, these battles are material, they are over land, they are over people, but they're also representational, right? So they worked actually with an architect who designed this for them. So this is one of the sites that they are trying to protect from being built into condos that has one of their shell mounds. And so they envisioned what would a monument look like for the public here, right? So this is, they've actually built one of these someplace else now in East Oakland. And so thinking about what does architecture of indigenous sovereignty look like, and how does it get there? I'm just going to breeze through this a little faster. So I'm not going to ask you to answer this question, just in the interest of your time. But what is architecture of Black and indigenous futurity? So like, think of it as like, what does Wakanda look like really? Okay, and I'm going to share some of the work that I'm now plotting, right, conspiring and hoping to do. And I hope that you have your own plots, which I'm going to ask you to share. What are you plotting? So at UC San Diego, we've started this thing called Indigenous Futures Institute, and it is led by indigenous faculty. And the understanding of indigenous futures is not a reservation system. It's not limited to a political system like nations and nation states. And it is built on this understanding that indigenous people have always been in relationship to the world and to each other, right? So trans-indigenous relations. It's built on understanding that Black and indigenous are not mutually exclusive categories. So there are Black indigenous people, there are indigenous migrant people, there are Black migrant people, right? So it's built on this other triangle of like Black, migrant, and indigenous, knowing that those are not fixed categories. So there's a lot of projects Indigenous Futures Institute does. I'm not going to go through all of them right now, but I'm just going to talk about one that has like an architectural implication, right, or an architectural need. And so there's a traditional vessel, they call them hakwayo, which I think just means boat, you know, but I feel cool saying it. And it's made out of tule reeds. This is an aerial view of an event that we held in collaboration with Kumeyaay Community College, the Indian Health Center, Birch Aquarium, Scripps Institution of Oceanography, the park system. And I think we launched on that day something like 50 tule boats, which was the most in Mission Bay in over 100 years. All right, these are some images. I was told by a young Kumeyaay man that they used to hunt whales with these things, which is sick, right? You know, so they go out and hunt whales. So, so these are, you know, they're very impressive. I'll say boats people. They were coastal people, and we launched them here in San Francisco's Mission Bay. So this is one of the heart centers of San Diego, of tourism, of beaches, and all that kind of thing. And you'll see this little area is not developed because this is part of our natural reserve system, and it's surrounded by development, and we launched it here. Now, I was involved with putting this together with Stan Rodriguez, who is the person who teaches people how to build these boats now. And our goal was never to launch a bunch of boats. Our goal was to get Kumeyaay coastal access formalized. So we're still working on that, right? So this is their land. How can they have whatever it is, cultural easements, return of property, rematriation, public lands like set aside, whatever it is. And so I connected them to the natural reserve system that our university runs, and then we learned that there actually is a whole plan to restore wetlands because all this development here is illegal. And so this was finally passed within this year, 2022. And this is actually an island, and that's going to be restored. There's a waterway here that's going to be restored. But the question is, what does restoring wetlands look like? Are you going to This is called campland, which is mostly motor vehicles. This is all like motor vehicle, motorized watercraft areas. This is a golf course. And so there's huge public debate about this right now because there are vested private interests who have profited off of whatever business they have there. And so it's very complicated. This is an image from the group that has been fighting for wetland restoration for over 20 years. This is their same image, but taken by Campland, right? And now, so they're using the very same map, and now they're sort of discursively challenging it by calling it marshland. So they're saying they're going to turn all this recreational land that everyone enjoys into marshland, right? So this is a representational fight. My interest, obviously, is not only wetland restoration, but imagine if Kumeyaay Community College, which is currently at one of the reservations, which are all in remote areas pushed far away from things, could have an educational center right here, right? So how do we bring that about is actually sort of an architectural problem. Because if you had people could design it and show it, that strengthens the plot. That strengthens the narrative. One of the groups we're working with is this group called ourworlds.io. I recommend that you look them up. They are sort of a mixed reality app right now. This is one of their VR things. You can see these are actually the Thule boats. What they have is the augmented reality thing where you can look at a place and it will drop an object there for you, like a boat or a statue. Some of us might be located on these tiny plots, right? So I would like you to take a couple minutes to share something that you're doing with the person next to you and speculate, like, how could this be a plot for Indigenous and Black futures? 2 minutes. All right. I know there's so much to talk about, and I'm sure we're going to have a reception afterwards where we can all hang out and talk some more. But let me just wrap up by saying, you know, I think one of the quandaries we always face is what do you do when you live in this large of a structure, a plantation structure, let's say it is, right? And how does architecture fit in there? Isn't architecture just building buildings within capitalism? Isn't it just dependent on extractivism? Isn't it just dependent on these opportunities created through these unequal relations of wealth and power, right? And then, if that's all true, then that makes something like designing for pluralism just a small project within this meta project of capitalism and extraction. Right? That's a cynical way of looking at it. Or maybe, could there be an even bigger meta project? Could the meta project be decolonization? Could it be building these indigenous futures that people have been doing since before capitalism existed? Could it be that we're doing that? And capitalism is actually a small project. It's the current condition in which we are doing decolonizing work. So thanks so much for your time today. And look forward to more conversations with you. All right. All right. And thanks for your patience. I don't know if we have time for Q&A, or do we?
I'll say.
Right. Thanks.
I just wanted to say thank you, Wayne, for that talk, and also for sort of disturbing our status quo lecture format. I think it's nice to have people actually engage and have a little bit of chatter in the middle of a lecture. So thank you so much for that, and also thank you for framing, how embedded we are in the plantation logic. Specifically from the standpoint of architecture, urbanism, development, how I think it's really important for us to reflect on how embedded we are in this system, but also to think about the optimism that you affiliate with thinking about Black and Indigenous futurism and futurity. So I think that's all really incredible food for thought, and I know that the students will have many questions, and so I'm going to reserve maybe the first 2 questions for students, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the group. You can raise your hand and I'll pass you the microphone.
Ask me anything. If I can't answer it, I'll just not answer it. Thank you, Jimmy.
Sorry, I don't have anything good, but maybe we could ask, what sorts of speculative fiction works are you looking to for your own kind of I don't know, there's a wealth of things happening in both Indigenous and Black cultures in America, at least. I'm sure everywhere else too, that you could draw from. But is there anything in particular that you would point us towards that you've found inspiring in your work lately?
That's a great question. Thanks for asking. Speculative fiction. I mean, right now Octavia Butler's on my mind just because I was talking about, I'm a big fan of all the people that are part of Octavia's brood, who sort of put into practice what they are reading into her work. So I sort of also study what other people are doing. I think, the other random thing on my mind is I don't know if it's speculative, but I keep thinking about reservation dogs lately. And I think about, there's short fiction pieces. One of my friends wrote one on cyborgs, who's Native Hawaiian, and so I was interested in that. That was much more about being a cyborg and surviving the academy, as it were. But let me think, what else? I mean, farm workers. So my colleague Curtis Matters actually, he watches Cesar Chavez's home videos. I don't know if y'all know who Cesar Chavez is, but so that's an interesting research project, and to study just why was Cesar Chavez taking so many home videos. This is back when we didn't have these things, right? And he talks about how farm workers have always been doing speculative work about the future, and he studies farm worker theater, Teatro Campesino, where they perform in the fields and imagining a different future. So that's interesting. What are you reading? There's a few things. Yeah.
The ones that I'm looking back on now, and you talk about it, is N.K. Jemisin, who's kind of been gotten a lot of press lately, and it's a little bit more like fantastical in some way, but she uses that as a vehicle to maybe go some distance further than what's easy to imagine, which I think is probably a useful thing in this sort of work. Sometimes we do things like what we can see in that rendering there, where you can imagine it being built tomorrow, and sometimes something a little more fantastical is good. There's a movie called Traficante de Sueños, I think, like the Dream Trafficker, which is kind of a interesting one too. Takes place in this sort of like southwestern, North Mexico, southwestern United States, and looks at kind of the realities of migrant work and maybe a nearer future where dreams and these sorts of things you can implant in people as a way of kind of escaping the reality of this kind of new, almost kind of plantation future that we've arrived at. So that's maybe relevant too.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. It made me think, actually, we have a reading group with my undergrads, and the upcoming book is Dry, and that's imagining a future with no water. It's near future stuff. And then I actually read a lot of my students' writing. So I used to have a class called World Making. It was like 300 students, and everyone had to make a graphic novel. But the rules were you have to create a world, and the world has to have racism, heterosexism, colonialism, like all the messed up things. And then you have to populate that world with people you love and see what they can do, right? So that was sort of the challenge. We had our own comic book convention. It was huge, actually. It was, so, but I think that's training for what we're actually doing, right? Because the reason we have to imagine a world that's broken like that, a world that falls apart, is that's the world we're in. And we have to populate with people we love because that's our reality as well. Thanks for that question.
Since I didn't see other student hands, I'll also open it up to the rest of the group. Oh.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I really like the image you showed of I guess it was the plot across the creek at the Werner Hogg plantation of the enslaved person's home. And I think that really underscored the idea of, that resistance and like the future we want is grassroots and comes from the individual, and like, it might not start in the home, but it starts from that place. And I'm wondering if you also see places for more institutional like investment in those futures, or like, right? Like when do these larger systems come in, right? Because we were talking here about indigenous reservations in the U.S. and how there might not be all that we expect them to be, right? Because they're still enmeshed in something in the American system, right? So,
right. Thank you for asking that question, because I feel like that's our work, right? So I'm a college provost, and so that's ironic position to be in. And I took the job, or I applied for the job when I was nominated after talking to the student leader who asked me, I asked the student, should I apply for the job? And she said, think about the things you want to get done. Can you do it better from that position or as faculty? And I genuinely didn't know the answer, but I knew I was faculty, so why not try this? And so I think it is like, so the bitter irony of the plot is all the life making that Black people do on the plot sustains and reproduces the plantation. I mean, this keeps the plantation running. So that's like the bitter irony, right? But some of you may feel that way today, right? I mean, I think that's also part of the plantation logic is the resistance and that bitter irony is intelligence, right? So yeah, I'd like to believe that. I mean, there's like, first there's disruption, and then there's, I think, maybe more sustained reassembling of these institutions. But I'll give you a story of disruption that one of my friends tells me all the time. So she's actually Kumeyaay, Native American woman, grew up on the reservation, remembered days where there was like no running water. And she always says, how we got running water and electricity and all these things? It was Richard Nixon. right? And so people hate the story, right? You know, they're like, Nixon, right? And she's like, yeah, he was the greatest friend in the White House that we've ever had. You know, like people hate it when she says that, and that's why she says it, right? She just gets a rise out of people. But the interesting thing about Nixon is that, you know, he has, so one of the co-director of Indigenous Futures Institute has this word that she calls like, this phrase that she says, everyone has their like, you know, native story, like non-native people. Like they have the story of like some native person or some experience, and that's sometimes what gives them a framework, right? And so Nixon has this kind of story where he went to like Whittier College and played football and basketball, badly, by the way. But the coach of all those sports was a Luisteño man. Wallace is his last name. So Southern California, all-American athlete, this coach. And it was through interacting with this coach that he learned about not only the sort of, you know, imagined distance paths of genocide, but the ongoing harms that are being done to indigenous people. And so he was the one who reversed, under his presidency, I'll say, there was also the American Indian movement, Occupation Alcatraz. There's lots of people doing things to encourage this kind of behavior. But like he, you know, under his presidency, they reversed tribal termination. Like they had infrastructure bills passed to do these things. And so arguably, you know, Wallace influenced Nixon, who had played some part in indigenous futures, right? So I do think like all this stuff is permeable. It doesn't mean all of it is good, but it's all permeable. I'm realizing it's getting late, but do we have time for one more question?
We can do one more question.
Okay.
Thanks very much for your talk. I guess my question for you is, if we're today in the science fiction future of sort of slave era plantations, thinking about our own science fiction future, in your mind, would that be a world that doesn't have spaces like this, where there's just one system that has accommodated everything? Or would there still be something like this kind of inside-outside condition that might be intrinsically productive?
Wow, thank you for that question. That's a great question. I mean, I think the theme of this lecture series is pluralism, and like I definitely don't believe in the one utopia. And I think that this is something that I've learned a lot from indigenous sovereignty, is, you know, there's over 500 nations just in the United States, and with different languages, right, with different familial governance structures. You know, some of them are matriarchal, some of them are not, and I think it is understanding kind of how people's sovereignty are limited is like really important, because the thing we live under right now is a supremacist sovereignty. It's this belief that, in this case, let's say the U.S. nation state is completely sovereign over all things and all people and all beings, even beyond the borders of the country at this point, right? And sovereign over the air, sovereign over the mountains. And I just saw heard from one of my friends who's now a professor of, I think, in business school in Australia, kind of a weird place, right? But like, he's researching the legal status of things like mountains, like that can now sue in court, right? And successfully. And so thinking about how non-human sovereignty is a possibility. And so I think like the plurality of sovereignty is actually a really important thing. I think it is a type of balance that and it can respect particularities. It's not perfect, so I think there will always be inside, outside. I mean, Audre Lorde always said, you know, I'm the outsider in any group I join. Doesn't matter what it is, right? And I think at times she reveals how painful that is to her, but at the same time, it is what gives her insight. It gives her a certain wisdom and gives her a certain ability to speak back to power. And I mean, I think that's a hard person to be. and I guess I'll end with this. This is the last question, right? There's this beautiful book. Now I can't remember what it's called. It's a Haitian American woman, Edwidge Dendecat. Her first book, title will come back to me, but she talks about growing up in Haiti. This is her fictional character that resembles her, right? And then her mother's working in New York, so she's really being raised by her aunt, Tanti something, right? And her aunt tells her all these stories, right? And these stories are her source of wisdom and knowledge that carries her through not only surviving Haiti, but then surviving New York when she moves there, right? And one of the stories her aunt, that the character's aunt tells her is she talks about this place where people are tall and powerful. And they're tall and powerful because the Creator's given them a piece of the sky to hold on their heads, right? And so they have to be tall and powerful. But the moral of the story that the aunt tells her is, so if you see a lot of hardship in your life, it's because the Creator thought you were strong enough to hold up a piece of the sky, right? So I think that's the burden of the insider-outsider perspective, and like, why would someone pick up that burden? Why would someone carry a piece of the sky on their head? And not everyone should have to do that, but I think that is the charge, and that is the change that is coming. Thanks so much. All right, everyone. Have a great night. Happy to stick around if anyone wants to talk.